Hello. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the 5 questions that I've assigned for you this week. The first question talks about a protagonist. So you want to define what a protagonist is, and then you want to discuss some possible answers for who the protagonist is in the story, The Destructors, because that's the short story that you're reading this week, The Destructors by Graham Greene. So a protagonist is basically who the story is about. It's the main character in the story. And there are a couple of examples you could look at. You could look at Blackie. He seems to be the leader of the gang to start, but very quickly Trevor or T usurps him. And so you could argue, well, he's the protagonist because the story's about him. Some of you may actually look at the gang as the protagonist. And therein lies a point that you need to be aware of, that a protagonist doesn't have to be an individual. It could be a group of people, so that's quite appropriate. There is a fair amount of symbolism going on in this story as well, so we could get into that. I won't discuss that right now. Certainly you could come up with an example of what does the gang represent within the story in regards to symbolism, and the symbolic nature of the gang might lead you to believe that the gang represents something else, and that something else is the protagonist. So once you read the story, think about some of the options there, and then you come up with the particular answer you believe is best appropriate, and maybe a couple of lines to discuss why you believe that this person or this group of people or this thing is the protagonist. In the next question, I talk about antagonist. An antagonist obviously is the protagonist's worthy opponent. So again, depending on who you choose for the protagonist, that would dictate who your antagonist is. You could say, for instance, if it's Trevor, maybe the antagonist is Blackie. Or if the protagonist was the gang, the antagonist could be the house, Old Misery's house. And you need to be aware that, in fact, an inanimate object is just a fancy word for something that's not alive. An inanimate object can be an antagonist. So bear that in mind. And then again, you can go a little bit deeper, look at symbolically what the house represents, and what symbolically the house represents could be the antagonist for symbolically what the gang represents is the protagonist. Okay? The third question that I gave you asks you to talk about conflict. So you need to be aware, in English literature, there are 3 types of conflict. There's man versus man versus himself, and man versus the environment. And I do ask you to consider those 3 examples of conflict and come up with examples from the story that illustrate those 3 types of conflict. And in fact, there are 3 examples of those 3 different types of conflict within the story. So for instance, if you were thinking of man versus man, you could talk about Trevor, and you could talk about Blackie. Just go into a little bit of detail and tell me why you think that that's a conflict and what that conflict entails. If you were talking about the gang and let's say Old Misery's house, again, that would be an example of conflict, but that would be man. I know it's a gang, so it's actually men, it's plural, but that's versus the environment, the house representing the environment. And the last example, man versus himself, we're talking about an internal conflict. So think about a time within the story where a character might have been struggling with a particular concept. An example might be where Blackie, if you remember, Blackie loses his leadership to Trevor. He's walking across the parking lot, kind of kicking stones and thinking, I'm out of here, I quit. And then thinks to himself, well, if the gang actually is successful and they manage to destroy the house, then in fact, we could be the most famous gang in London. And I think I want to be part of that. And so in actual fact, Blackie comes back. He gives up his position, but is still willing to be a smaller part of the gang as opposed to the leader of the gang. But that experience of struggling with whether I quit or whether I continue with the gang, that might be an example of man versus himself. So if you can, come up with other examples. I mean, those are the examples I gave you. It'd be kind of nice if you came up with other examples. But just talk about the example and what is the man and what is the environment, or what is the man versus himself, or what is the man versus the man. Okay? So the next question I ask you to talk about a happy ending. That's a bit of a trick question. It's not really if you know it, but if you don't know, it's a trick question because you might think a happy ending is a happy ending, right? Where everybody lives happily ever after. That is not the definition of a happy ending in English literature. In English literature, the definition of a happy ending is the protagonist achieves his goal. And for instance, if Blackie was the protagonist, what's his goal? If Trevor's the protagonist, what's his goal? If the gang is the protagonist, what is the gang's goal? And do they achieve that? If in fact they achieve that goal, regardless of whether that goal is positive or negative, it could be a negative goal and it's still a happy ending. And that's why you might be a little confused, because clearly at the end of the story, many people finish reading the story and think, well, that's kind of sad. You're not sure why the gang was destroying Old Misery's house. Old Misery never really did anything to them. Again, when we look at it at a deeper level, symbolically, you might start to see what the actual goal was. But regardless of whether the goal is in fact positive or negative, it makes no difference. If the protagonist achieved his goal, then it is a happy ending. And if the protagonist didn't achieve the goal, then it's not a happy ending. And then lastly, we talk about this idea of what makes this gang a little different, right? Because in a typical story, you have a protagonist who has some kind of a goal. He struggles, tries to overcome obstacles, and eventually he achieves his goal or he doesn't. And what makes this story a little different? Well, there's a couple of things. One is, as we've already discussed, the goal is not a positive one. The goal is a negative one. But the other thing to bear in mind is that the gang is very different. When you think of most gangs tend to profit from their actions. They make money by whichever way they decide to make money. And we know clearly in the story they don't make money. In fact, it's the exact opposite, because if you remember, when Trevor and Blackie that first night get together, they burn the banknotes. So in actual fact, they're not making any money at all. They're destroying the money rather than profiting from their actions. And that suggests that the gang is very different than other gangs you've probably run into. But what it'll also do is lead you maybe into some insight into the symbolic nature of the gang and what in fact they're trying to achieve. Because they are so different, it seems kind of strange. And that's why the story is called The Destructors, because in actual fact, this gang is very destructive. So the question you want to ask yourself is, what in fact are they trying to destroy? Yes, literally, they're trying to destroy the house. But if we're looking at a more symbolic level for this, what figuratively might that house represent? And what else might they be trying to destroy? So hopefully this conversation has helped clarify a little bit about the story. Read the story, enjoy the story, go through the 5 questions. Don't forget, there is a deadline, and look at the deadline. Clearly you have a week. So these answers, the questions that you have to finish off, are due on Wednesday at 11:59. Don't wait until Wednesday. Do them early, get them over with. And obviously I've uploaded this to YouTube to help you tackle some of the questions. So I hope you have a lovely day, and I will see you next day in class. Bye.